Shall we bow our heads for prayer? Eternal and loving Father, what a joy it is to come into your presence, to study the word which you gave us through the power of the Holy Spirit. We ask that as we study about history's invisible guide, that your Spirit will show us that this world is not composed of a series of disconnected events, but that you are seated on the throne of the universe, guiding and controlling everything to your intended end. We ask that you will help us to understand how this applies to our own personal walk with you. And we thank you for hearing our prayer, for we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do calamities afflict our lives? Why many times do our lives appear to be out of control with no guiding force? Well, in our subject today, we are going to study about history's invisible guide. And we're going to notice that history generally, and our lives specifically, are not composed of disconnected events that have no relation one to another. We're going to see that in this world and in each of our lives, there are two forces struggling to gain dominion and power. And we're going to notice that even though many times bad things happen to good people, God ultimately will use those bad things and He will turn them into good. But it's only as we look back on our lives that we understand this. When we're looking forwards and we're going through these trials, it's difficult many times for us to understand exactly what is happening. Now, we're going to study this subject from the perspective of a wonderful story that we find towards the end of the book of Genesis. It's the story of Joseph. I don't see any story in the Bible that speaks about God's providence in such a way as the story of Joseph. Now, it probably would be a good idea for us to examine, first of all, the home life of Joseph. You know, we live in a world today where people have a tendency of passing the buck and blaming other people, blaming circumstances, blaming heredity, blaming the environment for the things that happen in their lives. But as we look at the life of Joseph, we discover that Joseph had a less than ideal heredity, he had a less than ideal environment, and less than ideal circumstances in his home. And yet, Joseph cooperated with God, and the end of the story is absolutely glorious. Now let's talk a little bit about the family life of Joseph. As you know, Jacob was deceived into marrying Leah, but he did not love Leah. And the Bible tells us that Leah, with Jacob, had 4 sons. Let's read about this in Genesis chapter 29 and verse 30. Genesis 29 and verse 30. It says here, "Then Jacob also went in to Rachel, and he also loved Rachel more than Leah. And he served with Laban still another 7 years." Can you imagine what it was like to live with a husband that really did not love you? And yet we're told in the story that Jacob and Leah had 4 sons. If you continue reading after this verse, they had Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Of course, Jacob later married Rachel. And Rachel was envious of her sister. In fact, we find in Genesis 30 and verse 1, this sibling rivalry being clearly and strongly expressed. Notice Genesis 30 and verse 1. It says, "Now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, "Give me children, or else I die." This is quite a sibling rivalry that we have here. You know, Leah has had these 4 sons. Rachel can have no children. And so Rachel comes up with an idea. She says to Jacob, "Jacob, why don't you go into my maid Bilhah, and maybe you can have children for me with Bilhah?" And so that's exactly what Jacob did. He went into Bilhah, and Rachel, through Bilhah, actually had 2 sons. The names of the 2 sons were Dan and Naphtali. Now, this led Leah to say to Rachel, "Oh yeah? You think that you can have children with your servant? Well, I've got a servant too. And I can have my servant go into Jacob as well." And so we find in Genesis chapter 30 and verse 9, when Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob as a wife. And now Jacob has with Zilpah, the servant of Leah, the following sons: Gad and Asher. But Rachel still did not have sons of her own. And so at this point, you'll notice that these 2 sisters are struggling against each other. This tremendous rivalry. And Leah rubs it in Rachel's face that she has children and Rachel doesn't have her own children. Now it's interesting that after Leah has 2 sons with Zilpah, Gad and Asher, that Leah actually bore 3 more children. This is found in Genesis chapter 30 and verses 18 through 21. It says there, Leah said, "God has given me my wages, because I have given my maid to my husband." So she called his name Issachar. Then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a 6th son. And Leah said, "God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun. Afterward, she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. So at this point, Leah has had 7 children of her own and 2 children with her servant. And Rachel has only had 2 children with her servant. And of course, Rachel is envious of her sister. But God, according to this story, eventually opened Rachel's womb and gave her 2 children. Let's read about it in Genesis chapter 30 and verses 22 to 24. The first of these, of course, was Joseph. It says, "Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her husband and opened her womb. And she conceived and bore a son and said, 'God has taken away my reproach.' So she called his name Joseph and said, 'The Lord shall add to me another son.'" And so now Rachel has Joseph, but God has told her that she's going to have another son. And we find in Genesis chapter 35 and verse 18 that Rachel has her second son. His name, by the way, is Benjamin, the youngest of all of the brothers. It says there in Genesis 35 and verse 18, "And so it was, as her soul was departing, for she died, that she called his name Benoni, but his father called him Benjamin." Now, can you imagine what it must have been like to sit at the dinner table in this household? Jacob, who has 2 wives and 2 concubines, all sitting at the table with their 13 children. Can you imagine what Rachel's children must have said? Joseph and Benjamin must have said to Leah's sons, "You know, our dad doesn't love your mom as much as he loves our mom." And you can imagine the rivalry between these young men and among these wives. It was warfare. It was the worst type of environment. And then, of course, as the brothers of Joseph grew up, we find several of them with serious, very serious character flaws. For example, Joseph grows up in an environment where Simeon and Levi are cold-blooded murderers. You can read the story of Shechem. Amazing how they had all of the men of Shechem circumcised, and then when they were in the utmost pain on the third day, they turned against them and killed every man in that city. Cold-blooded murderers. You have Reuben, who was guilty of incest. You have Judah, who slept with a prostitute. You have also Reuben, who had the backbone of a jellyfish when it came to delivering Joseph from the wrath of his brothers. You had a dysfunctional group of brothers in this family, and this is the household in which Joseph grew up. So don't blame heredity, don't blame the environment, don't blame circumstances for the way in which your life moves, because we can thrive in the best of circumstances like Joseph did. Now, what sets the tone for this story is two dreams that Joseph had. Notice Genesis chapter 37 and verses 9 and 10. Genesis 37, 9 and 10. This is the one about the sun, the moon, and the stars. It says here, "Then he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers and said, 'Look, I have dreamed another dream. And this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bow down to me.' So he told it to his father and his brothers. And his father rebuked him and said to him, 'What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to earth before you?' So he's rebuked by his father for these dreams. But this sets the tone for Joseph's life, because Joseph knows that someday, he doesn't know how, he doesn't know when, but he does know that someday he is going to be Lord over his father, his mother, and his brothers. And so all throughout the course of his life, this guides his thoughts. God has a plan. I don't understand all of the circumstances, but God has a plan. And he decided that he was going to cooperate with God's plan. Now, we're told in the story that Joseph's brothers despised him because of these dreams that he had. Notice what we find in Genesis 37 and verse 11. Genesis 37, verse 11. It says here, "And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind." Now, I don't believe that Jacob understood how much his brothers hated him. And so we're told in the story that Jacob asked Joseph, who was 17 years old at this time, to take some provisions to his brothers who were tending the sheep. I believe that if Jacob had realized the hatred that his brothers had for him, the profound hatred, he wouldn't have sent Joseph. So we ask the question, why did Jacob send Joseph knowing how his brothers felt about him? And then we notice that Joseph comes to where his brothers are, and his brothers see him from afar. By the way, he's traveled approximately 65 miles at this point from Bethel, where Jacob lived, all the way to Dothan, according to the Bible. And Joseph is very tired, and when his brothers see him from the distance, they come up with an idea. They say, "This is the time to nip this in the bud. Let's kill him. Let's get rid of him, and then we'll see what will happen with his dreams." In fact, let's read this. It's found in Genesis chapter 37 and verses 19 and 20. "Then they said to one another, 'Look, this dreamer is coming. Come, therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit. And we shall say, some wild beast has devoured him.' Now, the question immediately arises, why didn't his brothers kill him? Obviously, they hated him enough to kill him. But for some reason, first of all, Jacob sends Joseph, knowing that his brothers despise him. Then when they say, let's kill him, their plans are interrupted, and they don't kill him, but they throw him into a cistern. Very strange, when he was hated so much by his brothers. And then it just so happens that when Joseph is in that cistern, at that very moment, at that very time, some Ishmaelites are traveling through that country to the land of Egypt. At that precise instant. Is this a coincidence? In fact, let's read about it. It's found in Genesis 37 and verse 28. It says, then Midianite traders passed by. So the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. Question: why did Jacob send Joseph in the first place? Why didn't his brothers kill him? Why at that precise moment did the Ishmaelites come by? Why were the Ishmaelites traveling to Egypt? Obviously, Joseph somehow had to arrive in Egypt. Now, it appeared like Joseph had gotten a pretty raw deal. Here, this good boy, obedient to his father, is being taken to a strange land for no reason, simply because of the jealousy and the envy of his brothers. Joseph could have said, what good is it to serve God? Look, I serve him, I trust him, and here I end up being sold by my brothers to Egypt. But Joseph knew that God had a plan. At this point, he didn't understand all of God's plans, but he knew that at some point his dream would be fulfilled. Actually, his two dreams would be fulfilled. And so now Joseph takes this long trip to Egypt. By the way, he would have retraced his steps from Dothan to Bethel. In fact, Ellen White says in the book Patriarchs and Prophets that he could see his father's tents from afar as the Ishmaelites were taken into Egypt. And then he would have had to travel from Bethel several hundred miles further south to Egypt. This trip would have taken a significant amount of time. Eventually, the trip comes to an end, and Joseph is taken to the marketplace to sell. And it just so happens, by coincidence, and I say that I say that kind of like ironically or sarcastically, by coincidence, a man named Potiphar ends up in the marketplace and purchases Joseph. In fact, let's read about it, Genesis 39 and verse 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. And so Joseph ends up, of all places, there are many individuals who could have bought Joseph, but he ends up being bought by Potiphar. Now, I believe that there are two reasons in this story why Joseph ended up in Potiphar's house. Reason number one, it was necessary for Joseph to meet Potiphar's wife. And secondly, it was necessary for Joseph to sharpen his administrative skills, because God had a huge plan for him, a worldwide plan at that time, and he needed to be a keen and sharp administrator. And so God is preparing Joseph by administrating the house of Potiphar for these huge responsibilities. In fact, we're told in Genesis chapter 39 and verses 2 and 3, the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. By the way, this reminds me of the words of Jesus in Luke chapter 16 and verse 10, where Jesus said this, "He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much. And he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. In other words, it was necessary for Joseph to learn to be faithful in the small administrative duties in Potiphar's house in order to be qualified for the huge administrative duty which awaited him in the future. And of course, we know how the story develops. This faithful young man one day meets Potiphar's wife in the house, and Potiphar's wife wants to have sexual relations with Joseph. And we all know the famous words of Joseph. Let's read them in Genesis 39 and verse 9. Joseph says to this woman, "There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And Joseph's faithfulness lands him in prison. Now, what justice could there be in this? First of all, he's a good boy and he's sold as a slave to Egypt. And then now, because he's faithful to God in keeping the seventh commandment, he ends up in prison. You wonder at this point in the story, why did he end up in prison? Must it be perhaps that there was someone in prison that he needed to meet as this plot develops? Obviously, yes. At this point, by the way, Joseph had been in Egypt for 10 years. He was 27 years old. Now, another interesting aspect is that when Potiphar discovered what had happened with his wife and with Joseph, it actually didn't happen, we know, but the event had taken place. Potiphar, instead of killing Joseph, he has Joseph thrown into prison. Now, we know that he did not believe his wife's story, but he still could have had Joseph killed to save face, couldn't he? In fact, notice what we're told in Genesis chapter 39 and verse 20. "Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison." And so Joseph has gone from his home in Bethel to Egypt to prison, all in spite of the fact that he was faithful to God. And you might say, there's so much injustice in this story. I mean, these are bad things happening to a good person. But Joseph, in his mind, had the dream. He says, God has a plan. I don't know how all of these events are being weaved together, but God has a plan. And I know that these things are happening for a reason. I'm going to hang in there with God. Notice Genesis 39 and verse 21. It says there, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy. And he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison." And you say, yeah, right, the Lord was with Joseph. Where was God when he was sold as a slave to Egypt? Where was God when he was thrown into prison? You mean to say that God was with Joseph and he had mercy with Joseph? That's what the story says, because God had a plan. Now, by Joseph being in prison, he was able to further sharpen his administrative skills. You see, God had a purpose in allowing Joseph to go to prison. He needed to be polished for the duties that God had for him in the future. Notice Genesis 39 and verses 22 and 23. It says, "And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper." And so we find Joseph being faithful in the prison, being a faithful administrator, preparing for the duties that God has for him in the future. But of course, the real reason why he ended up in prison is because he needed to have an encounter with another individual in this story. Of course, all by coincidence. As he's in prison, at this particular place and time, a baker and a cupbearer of Pharaoh are cast into prison. And so you ask the question, why were the baker and the cupbearer cast into the prison at exactly that time when Joseph was in prison? There was a purpose in this story. Notice what we find in Genesis 40 and verse 8. And they said to him, this is speaking about the dreams that the baker and the cupbearer had. We each have had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please. And so, to make a long story short, the baker and the cupbearer tell Joseph their dreams, and Joseph says to the baker, I'm sorry to tell you that you are ancient history, so to speak. And he says to the cupbearer, you are going to be released from prison, and you're going to end up serving wine to Pharaoh again. And then Joseph says in Genesis 40 and verse 14 to the cupbearer these words, but remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. So he says to him, when you get out of this place, please remember me when you go before Pharaoh. And the interesting thing is, the cupbearer goes out, and he suffers some strange type of divine amnesia. He forgets Joseph. In fact, he forgets Joseph for 2 whole years. Why did he forget Joseph for 2 years? It wasn't simple forgetfulness. It's just that it was not time yet in God's calendar to act. You see, at this point, the cupbearer knew that there was someone who could interpret dreams. That was the important point. 2 years go by, and Pharaoh has 2 dreams. During those 2 years, Joseph patiently fulfilled his duties in the prison, knowing that God would intervene. And so Pharaoh has 2 dreams, the dreams of the stocks and the dreams of the cows. And to make a long story short, Joseph says this means that there are going to be 2 periods in the history of Egypt upcoming. One is going to be 7 years of superabundance and plenty, and there's going to be 7 years of devastating famine after that. Notice that God is revealing the end from the beginning, folks. Now, I want you to notice what we find in Genesis 41 and verse 25. By the way, Joseph at this point is 30 years old. He's been in Egypt since he was 17. So he's been in Egypt for a period of 13 years. God's plans know no haste and no delay. It says there, then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. And remember that what God permits, according to the Bible, God also causes. He doesn't cause it directly. He permits sometimes things to happen. And so the question is asked. In fact, Joseph says to Pharaoh, Pharaoh, you need to find a wise man who is able to gather during the 7 years of plenty, so that during the 7 years of famine, you have provision so that society will not disappear. And of course, Pharaoh says, who but you would be the ideal person to do this? You who have been able to interpret my dream. And the interesting thing is that at this point in the story, the tables begin to turn. In fact, Pharaoh says to Joseph, you will now be prime minister of Egypt. People will come before you, and they will bow, and they will show you respect, just like they show me. I will be above you, but you shall be the Lord over everyone in the kingdom. Is that exactly what Joseph had seen in his dreams? Absolutely. The tables are turning. In fact, what his brothers did to frustrate his dreams, God has now used to make his dreams come true. It reminds me of that text in Matthew 25 and verse 21, where we're told, well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. At this point, Joseph has been faithful in Potiphar's house. He has been faithful in his duties in prison. So God says, you have been faithful over little, now I will place you over much. But now we need to ask the question, why were there going to be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine? By the way, in the Bible, God does not directly cause famine. God does not cause himself calamities such as this. God allows Satan to work to cause calamities, what we call natural disasters. And you would ask, why would God allow 7 years of plenty and then allow the devil to devastate for 7 years not only Egyptian society, but all society in the Middle East? The answer is given very clearly in Scripture. It's because Satan wanted to eliminate and destroy the Holy Line. We've discussed this before. In other words, he wanted to get rid of Jacob and all of his family. But God knew this before it happened. And so God sent Joseph down to Egypt to make provision during the 7 years of plenty, so that during the 7 years of famine, the Holy Line from which the Messiah would come would not disappear from history. But we still have the question, why to Egypt? Why didn't God just allow Jacob and his family to remain in Canaan and to proliferate there without allowing the 7 years of famine, forcing Jacob and his family to move to Egypt? I'm going to put that on hold for now. Now notice Genesis chapter 41 and verse 46. It says, Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. Let me ask you, was the experience of Joseph in Potiphar's house and in administrating the prison an invaluable resource to Joseph now when he had to organize the gathering in of the grain from all of the land of Egypt to save all of civilization at that time? Obviously, he sharpened his skills for this huge responsibility which God now had for him. Notice Genesis chapter 41, verse 57. This famine not only afflicted Egypt, it afflicted Palestine. It says in verse 57 of Genesis 41, so all countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all lands. And so, Jacob says to his sons, sons, I want you to go down to Egypt because I hear that there's provision down there. Interesting. God has sent Joseph down to Egypt because somehow he wants Joseph's family to gravitate towards Egypt. There's a plan in taking them to Egypt. Not only to preserve the Holy Line, we're going to notice, but there's another reason why he takes them out of Canaan down to Egypt. And so Joseph's brothers make the journey down to Egypt. The first trip. Notice Genesis chapter 42 and verse 21. Then they said one to another. This is when Joseph says, you are all spies, and I'm going to throw you all in prison. They say, we are truly guilty concerning our brother, for we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Therefore, this distress has come upon us. And so Joseph says to his brothers, you say that you have a younger brother that stayed home? That your father wouldn't let him come with you? Well, in order for me to know that you're not spies, I want you to go and I want you to bring back that brother. And they said, our father will never allow us to bring back our brother. Joseph says, tough luck. In fact, he takes Simeon And he throws Simeon into prison. And he says, I'll leave him there until you come back with your younger brother. Now, why Simeon? Let's read about it first of all, and then I'll have a quotation from Patriarchs and Prophets. Genesis 42:24. And he turned himself away from them and wept, that is Joseph. Then he returned to them again and talked with them. And he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. Notice that he didn't only cast Simeon into prison, he bound him before he was cast into prison. Why did he do this? In Patriarchs and Prophets, page 225, we find this incisive comment by Ellen White. She says, on his return, that is after crying, he commanded that Simeon be bound before them and again committed to prison. In the cruel treatment of their brother, Simeon had been the instigator and chief actor. And it was for this reason that the choice fell upon him. You can imagine Simeon thinking, I was the one that had Joseph bound and thrown into the cistern. Now the tables are being turned. There's something strange going on here. Something strange happening. And so they go back to Canaan. And they tell Jacob, Jacob, Father, unless we take Benjamin back to Egypt, Simeon will be a prisoner forever. And Jacob says, forget it. You're not going to take Benjamin. I've lost Joseph. And now I only have one son left from my beloved wife, Rachel. You can't take him. But eventually, they're suffering so much hunger that Jacob decides to send Benjamin with his brothers. And so they take a second journey to Egypt. Notice Genesis chapter 43 and verses 28 and 29. They arrive in Egypt, and they say this to Joseph. And they answered, your servant, our father, is in good health. He is still alive. They bowed their heads down and prostrated themselves. Do you see what's happening here? What the brothers did to try and keep the dream from being fulfilled, now their very action has fulfilled the dream or the dreams that Joseph had. And so they bow before him. And we're told in Genesis 43 and verse 33 that Joseph sits them at his table by order of age. Now, they know that something really strange is going on here. Joseph is leading them to think. It says in Genesis 43, verse 33, and they sat before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth, and the men looked in astonishment at one another. What is this? That this individual knows how to sit us in the order of our age. But it gets even more interesting. We're told in Genesis 43 and verse 34 that Joseph gave Benjamin 5 helpings of food compared to his brothers. Notice what we find there. Genesis 43, verse 34. Then he took servings to them from before him. But Benjamin's serving was 5 times as much as any of theirs. So they drank and were merry with him. Why did Joseph do this? Because he wanted to see if they were still jealous and envious. But it says that they're happy. They don't mind that Benjamin has 5 times the helpings that they have. And so Joseph is saying, these individuals have gone through a conversion experience. They've been changed by this ordeal. Imagine, folks, for so many years hiding this lie from their father. Terrible, and seeing their father suffer, thinking that Joseph has died, and the guilt that goes along with it. And now they see these things happening. They don't care if Benjamin has 5 times the food that they have. And then, of course, you know the story. In Genesis 44, verses 12 and 13, they start their trip home. Joseph has had his cup placed in the sack of Benjamin. Notice how this is picked up in Genesis 44, 12 and 13. So he searched. He began with the oldest and left off with the youngest. And the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. And so they're all taken back. And now you can imagine the pain and the sorrow that the brothers are feeling. They're saying, our father has lost Joseph, and now he's going to lose Benjamin. And so they're taken back to where Joseph is. And Joseph says, why have you dealt with me this way? And he says it in a very harsh way. And the brothers begin begging for the life of Benjamin. And in fact, Judah says to Joseph, why don't you just keep me as a slave and let Benjamin go back to my father? Because if my father knows that he's lost another son by Rachel, it's going to break his heart and he's going to die. The brothers have gone through a tremendous conversion experience. There's no more envy. There's no more jealousy. They feel the pain of their father. Joseph is trying to calibrate them to understand how they feel at this point. And so Judah offers his life in place of the life of Benjamin. Now we still have that question that I left on the table. And that is, why was it even necessary for Jacob and his family to go down to Egypt? You see, folks, there was a prophecy which was uttered by God to Abraham several hundred years before. It's found in Genesis 15, verses 13 and 14. And it says this, then he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions. You see, there was a prophecy that God had given to Abraham, where Joseph knew that they were going to go down into Egypt. They were going to be there for 400 years, and then God was going to take them once again to the land of Canaan. And of course, immediately the question arises, why not just leave them in Canaan? Why bother to take them for 400 years down into Egypt to take them back to Canaan? Why not just leave them in Canaan? Why did God give this prophecy to Abraham? There was a very special reason. In our second textbook in this seminar, Patriarchs and Prophets, page 232, we find the reason. It says there, the promise had been given to Abraham of a posterity numberless as the stars. But as yet the chosen people had increased but slowly. And the land of Canaan now offered no field for the development of such a nation as had been foretold. Canaan was not a good environment for the building of a nation. She continues saying, it was in the possession of powerful heathen tribes that were not to be dispossessed until the fourth generation. If the descendants of Israel were here to become a numerous people, they must either drive out the inhabitants of the land or disperse themselves among them. The former, according to the divine arrangement, they could not do. And should they mingle with the Canaanites, they would be in danger of being seduced into idolatry. Are you understanding this? This whole scenario of Joseph having to go down into Egypt, and as a result, Jacob's family going down into Egypt, was because they could not stay in Canaan, because there were giants there that they could not overcome. It wasn't the time in God's calendar. And besides, if they had mixed with the Canaanites, they would have become corrupted by the Canaanites. She continues saying, Egypt, however, offered the conditions necessary to the fulfillment of the divine purpose. A section of country, well-watered and fertile, was open to them there, affording every advantage for their speedy increase. And of course, that was the land of Goshen. And now notice this. And the antipathy they must encounter in Egypt on account of their occupation, for every shepherd was an abomination to the Egyptians, would enable them to remain a distinct and separate people and would thus serve to shut them out from participation in the idolatry of Egypt. Are you understanding how God's plan is developing here? It took years and years for this plan to be fulfilled. And yet God's plan was fulfilled to the very letter. First of all, the holy line from which the Messiah would come was preserved. And secondly, Jacob and his family emigrated to Egypt, where they could live in Goshen, proliferate, grow in relative peace without becoming contaminated with the idolatrous practices of the Egyptians. Now let me ask you, as Joseph looked back upon his life, do you think he would say that it was worth it? You know, if you just think about the life of Joseph, from the time that his brothers took him and threw him into the cistern, I can imagine Joseph saying, oh, wow, what's going to happen now? He had the dream, and he had the prophecy given to Abraham in his mind, but he doesn't know exactly what's happening. But he cooperates with God. And step by step, God reveals to Joseph his plan, and Joseph cooperates with God. He walks step in step with God because he knows that God has a plan. Someday, God will make him Lord, and in this way, he will save the holy line, and he will prepare the world for the coming of the Messiah. You see, folks, history is moving under the guidance of God's omniscient and omnipotent hand. And it's moving toward a specific goal. History is not an ebb and flow of unrelated events. History is being nudged forward by an invisible hand. If I choose to participate, God's plan will be fulfilled with me. If I choose not to participate, God's plan will be fulfilled anyway without me. Kind of reminds me of the story of Esther. Mordecai says to Esther, Esther, you better go in and you better intercede for your people. And he says, if you don't, help will come from some other place. The beauty of this story is that Joseph decided to cooperate with God, step by step. He didn't understand everything that was happening, but he was guided by his dreams and by the prophecy given to Abraham. You see, folks, when we look at life after we've lived it, we can see the hand of God's providence. You see, I like to compare historical events with a thread in a tapestry. See, each event in our life is a thread that God is adding to the tapestry. And you only see the full picture when all of the threads come together. Then you know that God has been leading your life, and that what God allowed to happen and that what God caused was absolutely wise. Kind of reminds me of that verse in Romans chapter 8, verses 28 and 29. We all know this verse. Probably we can repeat it from memory. It says there, and we know. Notice it doesn't say we think. It says we know that all things, how many? Even the bad? Yes, even the bad? We know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. If we kept this in mind, we wouldn't grumble and gripe and complain about the things that happen in our lives. But many times when things come to our lives, calamities and problems and difficulties, we gripe and we complain and we say, Lord, why me? When really, we should not say, why me? We should say, Lord, I don't exactly understand what you're doing right now. This is a very difficult time in my life. I can't understand these circumstances, but Lord, you know what? You have more experience than me. And so I'm just going to kind of follow along. You take the step, and I'll walk right in your footsteps. I'll walk in your footsteps the way that you lead. And we can't go wrong. No matter how many calamities come to our lives, we can't go wrong. This reminds me of a fantastic statement in the book Desire of Ages, pages 224 and 225, that I'd like to read. You know this. You've read it before. Where Ellen White is speaking about the experience of John the Baptist. You know, you look at John the Baptist, he also was thrown into prison. Jesus never went to visit him. You would say, come on, he was Jesus' cousin. And Jesus didn't show any interest whatsoever in him. Here he's thrown into prison and is apparently abandoned and forsaken. What justice is there in this? Because John the Baptist was faithful to God. Why should he end up there? And of course, John the Baptist had doubts himself about what was happening. That is, until he sent his disciples to ask Jesus, are you the one that we're expecting, or are we to wait for another? And Jesus didn't answer the question. He simply performed miracles that whole day. You can read it in Scripture. And at the end of the day, Jesus says to the disciples of John, now you go back and you tell John what you've seen. And when they told John what they had seen Jesus do, we find in Desire of Ages that John now had peace. He knew that Jesus was the promised Messiah. And he was willing to give his life. He was willing to die. And then Ellen White says that John the Baptist, by his death, became an inspiration to many others who would be martyred for their faith. In other words, he saved many people through his death, besides all of the people that he saved through the message that he imparted from God. In this context is where we find this statement in Desire of Ages, pages 224 and 25. God never leads his children. Excuse me? What does the word never mean? Is there anything in never you don't understand? God never leads his children. Otherwise, then they would choose to be led if they could see the end from the beginning and discern the glory of the purpose which they are fulfilling as co-workers with him. So if we could see if Joseph had been able to see the end from the beginning, do you think Joseph would have changed anything? He would not have changed one thing. He would have said, okay, Lord, we're walking together through these trials and tribulations. He would have chosen the very way that God chose for him. Because if we knew the end from the beginning, we would not choose any other way than the way which God has established for us. In another very significant statement, in Desire of Ages, page 208, this also is very well known. We find this marvelous statement, because some people say, well, you know, Jesus, he had a different nature than we have, you know, and he was closer to his Father than we are. And, you know, we start making excuses as to why Jesus could overcome and we can't overcome. Notice what Ellen White has to say in Desire of Ages 208. So utterly was Christ emptied of self that he made no plans for himself. Sounds kind of like Joseph, huh? Joseph made no plans for himself. Every day he said, Lord, you know, show me what you want me to do. Show me what your plans are. Choreograph my life. She continues saying, so utterly was Christ emptied of self that he made no plans for himself. He accepted God's plans for him. And day by day, the Father unfolded his plans. By the way, the Lord's Prayer says, give us this week our daily bread. Thank you. It says, give us this day our daily bread. God does not reveal to us his plan in weeks or months or years. He reveals it in a day-to-day basis. And we're told here that Jesus made no plans for himself. Every day he said, Father, what are our plans today? Now you say, how does that affect us? Notice the last part of this statement. So, that means in the same manner, so should we depend upon God that our lives may be the simple outworking of his will. Isn't that a marvelous statement? And the key is, so utterly was Christ emptied of self. See, when we say, why is this happening to me? Why am I having these trials? Why am I having these tribulations? It's a manifestation of selfishness. We're supposed to say, Lord, what's in this for you? I'll walk with you. I'll follow your plan, just like Joseph did. And when you look at the story of Joseph, you have a glorious conclusion to a providential story. God leading step by step. On a lesser scale, we can have the same experience as long as we trust God the way that Joseph trusted God. We may not have a dream saying that we're going to be lords, but we do have a Bible that says that someday we will be lords. The Bible says that if we suffer with him, we will also reign with him. And Jesus says also in a text that we read, well done, thou good and faithful servant, because you have been faithful in little, I will place you over much. May that be the living experience in our life.